You've probably seen the recent headlines, right? The ones screaming that the US is banning Chinese data center tech. It sounds like this massive, definitive strike in the global tech rivalry. But here's the thing. That headline, it's actually wrong in three very specific, very important ways. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to look right past that sensational narrative and uncover the actual facts. We're diving into a component that almost nobody outside a data center ever thinks about, but one that is quietly revealing exactly where the real geopolitical choke points of the AI buildout actually sit.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the part nobody watched, the fact that this is a draft and not a rule, and what it means to control a data center's nervous system. Then we'll look at the installed base loophole, why immediate bans fail, and finally ask, is this really about security or industrial policy? Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The part nobody watched.
So let's set the scene. On August 4th, 2026, a Reuters report drops claiming the U.S. administration was drafting a measure to bar imports of new models of Chinese optical transceivers. And wow, the financial reaction to that single report was immediate and violent. It tells you exactly who the market thought was going to win on paper. We saw massive, double-digit stock market jumps for US-based optical suppliers literally overnight. Applied Optoelectronics shot up 16%, Coherent went up 13%, and Lumentum climbed 11%. A tremendous amount of money moved in a single day at the speed of financial panic, all based on one news report about a very specific piece of hardware.
So, what exactly is an optical transceiver anyway? Put simply, it's a small device that turns electrical signals into pulses of light so data can cross a data center at the speed of light. Now, for the past year, the whole export control fight was all about chips and GPUs, but this shifts the focus to the interconnect layer. This tiny component is the critical hardware literally wiring the entire AI boom together. Think of it like this. If the chips are the brain, the transceivers are the pathways letting the different parts of that brain talk to each other instantly.
Section 2. A draft, not a rule.
All right, here is the very first major correction we need to make to the mainstream narrative. The single most important word in that original reporting was drafting. The market didn't price in new facts. It priced a headline about a draft. This measure is reportedly being drafted through the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, but it is totally unpublished. The sources themselves actually stressed that the FCC could still modify it or shelve it completely, so nothing is final, nothing is in effect. And history tells us that pre-publication regulatory trial balloons like this often never launch at all. We basically just saw a double-digit one-day repricing of an entire component sector based on a rule that simply does not exist yet.
Moving on to Section 3, controlling the nervous system.
This brings us to our second major correction, and it's all about understanding the legal mechanism at play here. A quick, lazy reading just assumes this is another round of the GPU export control fight, but it's really not. See, the Commerce Department uses export controls to restrict what U.S. technology, like advanced compute and GPUs, can be sold to China. But this drafted measure? It runs through the FCC's Equipment Authorization System. That is an import authorization restricting what Chinese equipment can be brought into the U.S. and connected to domestic infrastructure. It's targeting the network fabric, not the compute itself. The U.S. isn't moving to control the brain here, it's moving to control the nervous system that wires the compute together. And that confirms that the interconnect layer has become just as strategically contested as the chips themselves.
To really get why this specific component is suddenly in the crosshairs, we have to look at the market breakdown. The Chinese incumbent at the absolute center of this story is Zhongji Innolight. They hold roughly a 27% share of the entire global data center transceiver market. But what's even more striking is that by one account, they generate about 90% of their revenue outside of China. And the US market alone reportedly makes up around 62% of their total revenue. That kind of market dominance is exactly why they were added to the Pentagon's list of alleged Chinese military-linked companies back in June, which, as we know, is a move that very often precedes tougher regulatory action.
Section 4. The installed base loophole. 70. That is the percentage of global transceiver shipments that come from Chinese vendors. U.S. cloud and AI operators have spent enormously on this hardware over the last couple of years, and they bought heavily from Chinese suppliers for a very simple reason. They had the scale, the price, and the high-speed products required for the massive AI buildout. What this ultimately means is that U.S. data centers are incredibly reliant on this hardware right now.
Now, the stated aim of this drafted FCC measure is to protect U.S. AI infrastructure. The official security rationales are preventing data theft, blocking malware, and avoiding service disruption from Chinese hardware sitting inside sensitive networks. And honestly, these are very serious forward-looking concerns. We definitely can't brush them off.
But there is a massive, glaring hole in that logic. A ban on new Chinese transceivers does absolutely nothing to the millions that are already installed. Because of that 70% market share we just talked about, there is an immense volume of Chinese optical modules already sitting in US data centers today. They're already plugged in, already wired into the network fabric. If this draft becomes a real rule, it only bars imports of new models. It leaves the existing enormous exposure exactly where it is, completely unaffected.
Which brings us to Section 5, why immediate bans fail.
So you might be wondering, why wouldn't the US just rip and replace everything immediately? Well, production is the product, and capacity just doesn't teleport. First off, while US companies like Coherent and Lumentum make incredibly competitive technology, they simply lack the scale to replace Chinese supply overnight. Second, you can't just swap vendors on a Friday afternoon. Optical transceivers require extensive, rigorous testing and compatibility validation against the data center's specific switches and network architecture. And third, and this is a huge critical detail, Innolight is reportedly a major supplier to NVIDIA and Google. So a broad, immediate ban wouldn't just hurt the Chinese incumbent, it would directly disrupt the very American champions of the AI buildout it's supposed to protect.
Furthermore, the supply chain is absolutely not waiting around to be banned. Chinese companies are already routing around the risk. Companies like Innolight and Eotalink have been physically moving production to Thailand to denationalize their manufacturing footprint. A ban based purely on Chinese origin runs straight into this very obvious workaround. On top of that, innovation is accelerating fast. On the exact same day that the US reporting broke, Chinese optical shares actually rallied on domestic news that they are mass-producing next-generation co-packaged optics, which physically integrates the optics directly with the switch silicon. The technology is simply not standing still while this policy is being drafted. Finally, Section 6, Security or Industrial Policy.
Let's compare these two different lenses. If you look at this drafted measure purely as a security policy, it has a massive hole you can see right through, because it leaves all those vulnerabilities in the installed base completely untouched. The security rationale and the actual remedy just do not line up. However, if you read this as an industrial policy, a deliberate, calculated move to redirect the flow of future orders and reshore a strategic component category to domestic champions, then it is entirely coherent. Under that lens, it makes perfect sense. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought today. We've seen that the interconnect layer is the new geopolitical bottleneck. We've seen how a mere draft completely moved the market and how a ban on new imports totally ignores the millions of devices already powering our infrastructure. So ask yourself, if the existing hardware is left entirely untouched, is this drafted measure actually about security? Or is it just industrial policy designed to build up domestic suppliers? It completely changes how you look at the intersection of global supply chains in the future of AI. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.